Jonathan was just 15 years old when he hacked into the Pentagon. He didn't have any political motivation and simply did it for fun. But what he found was shocking, and the government couldn't just let this slide. So they brought in the FBI to arrest this young man and take him down. But how far would they go? Here's the story of the kid who hacked the Pentagon and paid with his life. It all started when Jonathan began to explore the internet. At first he was just a normal teenager looking for entertainment. However, soon he became bored with games and movies and wanted to try something new. He decided to try his hand at hacking, and that's when everything changed. As a beginner, Jonathan had no idea where to start, so he looked online for some guidance. To his surprise, he discovered an online forum with people discussing how to hack into computers. It was like a goldmine for him. He could learn how to do something that not many people knew about, and it was free. All he had to do was listen, learn, and practice. And over time, Jonathan got really good at it. One day he decided to try his skills on a large scale. He managed to hack into the US military's computer system and steal 1 million credit card and debit numbers. Not only did he get access to private information, but also saw top-secret documents. What had started as a hobby was now something much bigger, but Jonathan wasn't done yet. He kept on hacking and stealing data from various sources until finally he hit the jackpot again. This time he managed to infiltrate the NASA system and stole another 4 million credit card and debit numbers, along with more confidential files. His total haul was staggering, and he had managed to pull off one of the biggest data breaches in US history. At first glance, you might think that Jonathan had committed a massive crime, but that wasn't his view. He saw himself as a digital explorer, uncovering secrets that were hidden from the public eye. He thought he was doing nothing wrong and certainly wasn't harming anyone by accessing these systems. Why would he be punished for simply exploring? Unfortunately for Jonathan, the government didn't see things the same way. They believed he was a national security threat and needed to be taken down. The problem was they didn't know where to start. Jonathan had covered his tracks well, and there was no trace of him anywhere. However, they did have one lead: his online alias. With this information, they were able to track down his IP address and trace it back to his school. Once they had that, it wasn't hard to find out who Jonathan was. In January 2000, Jonathan turned 16 years old, and the FBI decided that was the perfect time to make their move. They raided his house and took him into custody. They also confiscated several computers and other personal items, which contained evidence of his hacking activities. When Jonathan was questioned, he admitted to everything. He told the FBI about how he had managed to infiltrate these systems and steal such a vast amount of data. He even showed them how he had done it. Jonathan was shocked by the raid, but he wasn't afraid. He didn't think that what he had done was illegal, and certainly wasn't expecting to be arrested. However, after talking to the FBI, he realized that he had made a mistake. He had put himself in a lot of trouble and now faced serious consequences. Jonathan promised to the FBI that he would never do it again and asked for their forgiveness. But the government wasn't having any of it. They had caught a dangerous criminal and were determined to make an example of him. Despite his age, they charged him as an adult, and Jonathan's life would never be the same again. 3 months after the FBI raid, Jonathan was formally charged with 17 counts of fraud, computer crimes, and illegal entry. If convicted, he could face up to 60 years in prison. Jonathan was shocked. He couldn't believe that he was facing such serious charges for something that he had only done for fun. He tried to argue that he was just a teenager who had made a mistake, but the government wouldn't listen. They were determined to make an example of him and send a message to other hackers. Jonathan's trial was highly publicized, and the media had a field day with it. He became known as the teenage hacker who had infiltrated the Pentagon and stolen top-secret data. The government was using Jonathan's case to send a message to other potential hackers. They wanted to show them that even a teenager could be arrested and charged for hacking into their systems. On the other hand, Jonathan's family and friends were trying to defend him. They argued that he was just a curious teenager who had made a mistake and didn't mean to cause any harm. But the government wasn't convinced. They believed that Jonathan had deliberately targeted their systems and had no remorse for what he had done. The pressure was mounting on Jonathan, and he knew that he had to do something to defend himself. He hired a lawyer and began to prepare his case. However, he was up against a powerful opponent, and the odds were stacked against him. As the trial date approached, Jonathan's anxiety grew. He was facing up to 60 years in prison and knew that his life would never be the same again. On the day of the trial, Jonathan arrived at court with his lawyer. They had prepared a strong defense, and Jonathan was hopeful that he would be able to convince the jury that he was not guilty. However, the prosecution had a lot of evidence against him, and it was damning. The jury found Jonathan guilty on all 17 counts, and he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Jonathan was stunned. He couldn't believe that he had been found guilty and sentenced to such a long prison term. He had only done it for fun and never meant to hurt anyone. As Jonathan was led away in handcuffs, his lawyer vowed to appeal the decision. They argued that Jonathan was just a teenager who had made a mistake and didn't deserve such a harsh sentence. However, the appeal was denied and Jonathan was sent to prison. Inside the prison, Jonathan became known as the teenage hacker. The other inmates were impressed by his story and some even wanted to learn how to hack from him. However, Jonathan wasn't interested in teaching others how to break into computer systems. He had learned his lesson the hard way and didn't want others to make the same mistake. Over the next few years, Jonathan tried to turn his life around. He studied hard and earned a GED equivalent. He also began to volunteer and help other inmates. Jonathan was determined to make something of himself and prove that he could be more than just a hacker. However, his past was always going to follow him, and in 2004 he was transferred to a different prison. The news of the transfer spread quickly, and before long, the other inmates were pressuring Jonathan to teach them how to hack. Jonathan refused, but the inmates wouldn't take no for an answer. They threatened Jonathan and forced him to teach them how to break into computer systems. Jonathan was terrified, but he knew that he had to do something to protect himself. He agreed to teach the inmates how to hack, but only as a way to buy time. He was hoping that he could find a way to escape and start a new life. However, his plan was foiled when the prison guards caught wind of it and transferred him once again. This time they moved him to a maximum security prison where he would be safe from the other inmates. However, Jonathan was now in a much more dangerous environment, and he knew that he had to be careful. He continued to study and try to turn his life around, but the shadow of his past was always looming over him. In 2009, Jonathan was finally released from prison. He had served 9 years of his 60-year sentence and was determined to make something of his life. He enrolled in college and began to study computer science. Jonathan was hoping to use his skills to help others, but he knew that he would always be known as the teenage hacker. After graduating from college, Jonathan tried to get a job in the tech industry. However, his past caught up with him, and he was unable to find a job. He was labeled a security risk and no company would hire him. Jonathan was devastated. He had worked hard to turn his life around, and had hoped to use his skills to help others. However, his past was always going to be a barrier between him and success, so he took matters into his own hands and started his own company. Jonathan was determined to prove that he could be successful without the help of a traditional job. He worked hard, and the company began to grow. However, his past was always going to catch up with him, and in 2013, one of his clients found out about his hacking past. They immediately ended their contract, and Jonathan's company went bankrupt. Jonathan was devastated. He had worked so hard to build his company and had finally achieved success. However, his past had come back to haunt him, and he was back to square one. Despite the setback, Jonathan was not ready to give up. He knew that he had the skills to succeed and was determined to make something of his life. In 2016, Jonathan was given another chance when a tech company offered him a job. They were willing to overlook his past and give him a chance to prove himself. Jonathan was grateful for the opportunity and worked hard to make the most of it. He used his skills to help the company and quickly became a valuable asset. Today, Jonathan is a successful tech executive and is respected by his peers. He has turned his life around and is a role model for others who have made mistakes in the past. Despite his success, Jonathan knows that he could have avoided all of his problems if he had simply stayed away from hacking. He believes that curiosity can be a dangerous thing and warns others to be careful when exploring the internet. So what can we learn from Jonathan's story? Well, first of all, we should remember that curiosity can be a dangerous thing. Jonathan was simply curious about hacking and didn't mean to cause any harm. However, his curiosity led him into a world of trouble and nearly cost him his entire career. Secondly, we should always be aware of the potential consequences of our actions. Jonathan thought that he was just exploring the internet and having some fun. However, he soon realized that his actions had real-world consequences. Finally, we should remember that everyone makes mistakes, and we should be willing to forgive those who make amends. Jonathan was a teenager when he committed his crimes and was full of remorse. He turned his life around and used his skills to help others. So what do you think? Was Jonathan right to be arrested, or do you think the government overreacted? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks for watching.